If your orchestrations are feeling muddy, weak, or imbalanced, there's a high chance that you're not focusing enough on your voicings. When writing orchestral music, it's really easy to fall into the trap of just focusing on all the wonderful magical colors we can achieve with orchestra. Talking about voicings and good practice can feel a little bit dry in comparison to talking about colors, but without these good voicings, all of the other things fall apart. In this video, I'll take you step by step, first talking about what makes good voicings in general, and then breaking down each section of the orchestra, winds, brass, and strings, to talk about how to voice properly for each individual section, and ultimately concluding with full orchestra. And if you're interested, this was part of a live session which I do every Monday at 11 a.m. PST, so stay tuned for any future ones. So first, let's just talk about good voicing principles, because this is going to apply whether you're writing for winds, brass, strings, piano, anything. One of the most basic principles, important principles, is about the spacing of a voicing. All right, so if you're a pianist and you've just learned how to play piano, you're learning chords like this. Okay, triads, right? So we've got the root, the third, and the fifth of these chords. Right, now these are fine ways to space chords. However, obviously because we're working with a lot more players and a much wider range when it comes to the orchestra, this is not the best way to voice chords, especially if you're talking about full orchestra, because we're just simply going to be overdoubling these voices way too hard. Too many players on the voices, it's just going to be too dense. So the first principle we're going to talk about is actually the spacing of these chords. This is called a closed position chord, meaning the voicings are as tight together as possible. An open position chord would be something like this. So that's where we're taking this third, and we're pushing it up an octave, and you'll notice the spacing between those intervals is a lot wider than it was before. Now we have a fifth, and we have a sixth, right? So this is useful for a couple reasons. Number one, it allows us to expand and get a wider sound, which can be something that we like, you know. The other benefit that it has is, as we move lower into the range, closed position chords like this tend to sound muddier. So check this out. If I play this chord up here, it's audible. We can hear the chord here still, here. Now you notice here it's actually starting to get a little bit muddy. And if we go down to the bottom, obviously very muddy. Not a well-voiced chord here. Having an open position allows us to actually have more space between the notes, and therefore we can get away with having chords sit low like this. Now this is not the only way you could voice open position chords, and there's lots of other ways to do it, so we're going to get into some of the other principles of chord voicings. So the next part is going to be about the actual doubling of notes. The general principle is going to be doubling unisons is okay. So the root of the chord is permissible. You can pretty much use that quite a bit. There's better ways to voice this chord, but this is stable and safe, right? Doubling the fifth, or using more fifths, is also generally pretty okay. Right? But doubling the third is something you want to be kind of wary of. Every single note has a big overtone series. So if you play a note like this, you're actually not just hearing this note, you're hearing... It's all baked inside of this harmony. If you're using a third, you're getting all of these overtones, which is outside of the key of C, which is what we're playing in. Doubling these third 1, 2, 3 times, and doubling this fifth only once, and doubling the root only twice is an imbalanced chord. Better instead for us to do something like this. Because now we have the root playing 3 times, 1, 2, 3. We have the fifth playing twice, and the third playing twice. We could even get away with doing this. And you hear that the less I'm using the third, the more stable the chord feels. So this is all really important because as we move into orchestra, we have to be mindful of this. And it's challenging to be mindful of both at the same time. This is why piano sketching can be really useful, because you can establish the voicings early as opposed to composing and then realizing you've used the third 10 times. Let's start talking about how to actually voice these into the orchestra. So first off, I'm just gonna play maybe 3 chords. I'll find 3 chords that are gonna work. Let's do. Now these are solid piano voicings. You'll see that it's mostly open position. It's expanding out. One of the things I'm doing with the voicings as well is as the melody goes up, I'm having the bass go down. It's just making the whole thing feel balanced, hopefully, as it goes through. Let's first orchestrate this to strings because that's gonna be kind of the backbone of our orchestra. You could simply have this just be like an ensemble patch and have this play through here like this, and this would be pretty permissible. It's good to know the ranges. I do notice that people tend to write too low for most instruments. So they're tending to write where the instrument is just about to not have any more notes at the bottom. Generally, in my opinion, instruments sound best an octave and change higher than their lowest note. So if you have a violin and its lowest note is gonna be G, right? It tends to sound better actually up here. So if you're looking at this voicing, right? Maybe this actually wouldn't be ideal for violin, or at least it's not gonna be quite as flowing and expressive as you might want it to be. A viola might be a better choice, and splitting those players out even more because there's more expressivity in there. Or what you could do is you could have viola and violin doubled together. You get more power on the melody. So let's try that. Let's have violin 2 take the second lowest voicing, which as a shortcut, you could always just copy paste like this. Okay, now we have 2 voices left here. We've got the bass line, which we can just assign over to the bass, and we've got the cello line right here. So because we're working in 4-part voicings, this is what allowed me to actually have 2 instruments double. And you'll notice something interesting, the viola actually is sitting higher than the violin, and that's just because I wanted extra power on the melody. So let's play in these last 2 lines. I'm using sustain patches, by the way. Now this is me doing it verbatim, so it's just me taking this and literally assigning it down the line to the different string instruments. So just to confirm what it sounds like. Now what you could do, there's a couple other ways we could voice this. It's not just about taking the voicing and just assigning it directly. It's about utilizing the best voicings for each section, which are different. So for example, very traditionally in strings, we're gonna have bass and cello double each other at the octave. So a more powerful version of this would be having the bass and cello together an octave apart. We could have the violin maybe up an octave. And now take a look at our voicings here. Right, okay, and then violin 2, maybe we'd have them play divisi, so that means that they're split. So what you'll see I had the violin 2 do is fill in the inner voicings between those 2. If you wanted even more kind of lushness, you could have the cellos play divisi. So half the cello could play, and maybe the other ones could play. So something in between those voicings. I always recommend when you're doing voicings, when you're writing orchestral music, go inside the full view, look at all your instruments. I even do this split where I split it by region color, and it makes it very easy for me to check and analyze what I'm doing. If I have this cello play something like this, so I noticed something when I was just playing this. I have some overlap of the melody here. Too many Fs. Could you hear when it starts to separate? Right here? Parallel octaves. So I'm gonna actually have the cello do this. right? So it's a little bit better. All right, now let's go on to the winds. The way I like to think of the winds, it's different than the strings because the strings are all a uniform sound, meaning even though we have some differences in timbre slightly, they're more or less providing the same sound as strings. So we can move right up and down a whole string section. That's why ensemble patch strings works pretty well because it's the same sound. Winds and brass, slightly different. There's kind of two color groups that I use to categorize them, and that's going to be kind of the more rounded sound, and then the slightly more nasally or brassy sound when it comes to brass. So if we're talking about winds, I like to divide it thinking about the sound in terms of flutes and clarinets on one side, and then oboes and bassoons on the other side. Flutes and clarinets are gonna have that kind of rounded sound. Oboes and bassoons are gonna have that more nasally sound to them. So let's take a look at this voicing again. This is what we're working with. Again, you have to know which registers sound best for instruments. The instinct for, I think, early composers is going to be, oh, I'll give this to flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, right? However, if you listen to the flute range, that's very low for a flute. It's not going to resonate the right way. So better instead to think about which instrument's going to sound best on the melody and then kind of work your way down from there. So we're going to play the clarinet line in first. So again, I'm doing clarinet because clarinet's gonna sound better in this register. Now in winds, we're typically gonna have two of each player per section in the winds. So we'd have like two clarinets, two bassoons, two oboes, two flutes. The second of those players will also be able to double generally on an instrument that expands its section's range. So for example, second flute will also play piccolo. Second oboe will also play English horn. Second clarinet will play bass clarinet, and second bassoon will play contrabassoon. And the function is to basically expand the range of the woodwind section. For now, let's just have clarinet 2 play second line, and then bassoon 2. And I'm just gonna copy paste. So let's solo out these players. So we have the sections divided nicely, and this works. Okay? Now, if we wanted this to be in other instruments, we might have to pump the range up. So we might have to actually give it an octave up higher. So we could give it to flute, for example, but pull it up an octave, right? And we could then give this to flute 2. And then oboes 1 and 2 would split this potentially. We'll have to see the register and see how it works. So let's check this. So too low for oboes. So you could do something like have it go to clarinets, which is going to give the whole thing a much more uniform sound because, like I said before, flutes and clarinets are going to have kind of common colors to them. Now here's a good example. You notice here that even though this does work voicing-wise, do you hear the separation between the two? So it sounds like you can hear flutes and clarinets. There's a bit of a split between them. So the reason is because they're actually voiced in this way, where they're split out. Now there's other ways that you can voice woodwinds, specifically. You can do this with other sections, but woodwinds is very common, where you have them basically doing overlapping voicings or interlocking voicings. Maybe you have flute 1, clarinet, flute 2, clarinet 2. And in that way, you're creating more of a blend. In this case, the registers are a bit strange, so I'm not sure if that's gonna work as well as we'd hope. But just to demonstrate it, you can see this. So now this is flute and flute, clarinet and clarinet. So you can hear now, it's more blended. It's like a crossfade or a Venn diagram. Now, if we wanted that sound to be in the more reeded section, we could just give that over to the oboes and the bassoons. And these registers should work pretty well. All right, so there you go. You can obviously write a million different registers. You can have this go up even higher, up even lower. Now let's talk about blending and how we would do that. Because you could have all these instruments do the same role, but you don't have to do that. This is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. But let's say we're working with this string voicing here. So this was the one that was directly taking the piano. And you'll notice it's a little weaker. So we could expand the register up by having this be our flutes and clarinets. And the voicings are slightly different, but within each of these sections, the woodwinds are voiced well within themselves, the strings are voiced well within themselves, and therefore we should have a nice balance and some interest. Okay, so now let's talk about brass. So brass, similar to the winds, is gonna have the split sounds, right? So we're gonna have horns and tubas on one side and trumpets and trombones on the other side. So horns and tuba is going to have more of that rounded sound. Trumpets and trombones to me has more of that brassy sound. Now something to note that's gonna be important later in the next part is that when we have brass carrying harmony, it's very dominant, especially if it's loud. It can be very dominant. And so in that way, when brass is carrying that harmony, it opens up the strings and the winds to do other things. Because if we have all of them doing the harmony, it's just kind of unnecessary. The brass can carry a lot. So you could have trombones doing harmony, for example. Very common thing that you'll see in full ensemble is going to be trombones doing harmony, strings and winds doing melody and bass. Because you're going to be able to have that harmony carried out in the trombones on their own. Something I should note too about horns is horns are going to have what's called a dynamic equivalency of half. What that basically means is a horn is going to sound half as loud as any of the other brass players. And so generally, you need 2 horns to equal 1 trumpet or 1 trombone or 1 tuba. So in this case, if we wanted real balance, we might actually have 2 horns on each of these parts, but it's just something to be mindful of. That's why when you see film music, you see like 16 horns or 8 horns to really get a brassy sound. And oftentimes people are very surprised when they write film music and then they go and have it played by live musicians. And they're like, this doesn't sound like film music because the horns don't resonate as loud as you'd want them to and you only have 4 of them. I think I'd like to have a tuba maybe carry. Try this. I'm gonna have the trombone actually also double the tuba. Okay, and if we wanted more power on that melody, we could actually have the trumpet play the melody as well. Although I'm actually more partial to just having it not be in there because I think it's nice having the horns kind of lead. So you see I'm utilizing not all the players in the section. You don't have to utilize all the players in the section if it doesn't warrant it. Also, talking about the amount of players, with brass, you're gonna have 2 to 3 trumpets, typically 4 horns, 3 trombones generally, and sometimes one of them will be a bass trombone, and 1 tuba, because tuba is going to be super loud. When you have the bass players, it's typically only 1, maybe 2 of them, unless you have a really big ensemble. So now let's talk about if we want to expand this out. Let's say it was a much bigger kind of brassy section, right? So we're going to have trombones, I think, carry some of that lower harmony. Let's have a big one. So let's actually even maybe revoice this. So let's have the melody do something like this. Something like that. So. Okay. So we're going to work with something like this. And we're going to take this lowest voice. We're going to actually even bring this down an octave. Okay. That's how we're going to voice this next one. So we're going to have the trumpets, I think, be up on the top. We'll start with just this, and then we'll expand out and see what we need to add. Okay, and we're going to work at the bottom now. So it's okay to work from top and then bottom and then fill in the inner voicings. In fact, that's probably a more safe way to do this because it helps you determine what's missing. Okay, bass trombone. Okay, and let's have our horn actually, let's do something like this. So it's sort of filling in. It's still doing one of the melody notes, but it's also filling in the inner voicings. Okay, so now because we have the horn doing this lower one, I actually don't think we need the trumpet necessarily doing this bottom voice. Or if we do, we can maybe have our third trumpet doing something in the middle. Something like this maybe. See how those interact. So we might want to redistribute this part a little bit, so it's just a little bit more balanced. Now this part feels a bit off to me. Okay, now we're gonna use 2 trombones, and it's gonna be a very big full open voicing. So I'll look at where the horn ended. So it's here. So I'll stay just below that. So I'll compare kind of the lower harmonies here, see how that's sounding, because I think some things might need to get a little bit adjusted. Yeah, I want this to be nice and big. So let's actually go back. We'll go to the piano. Let's try that. Ba dun dun dun. Let's hear this. Nice. Okay, check the trumpets. See, this is what happens when you don't start with the voicings properly in the beginning. You have to compensate a little bit as you go. But it's okay, because now you get to see the true workflow as you go. Now let's check the trombones against the horns. So I check the nearest voicings. Ba da da da. I really would like ba-dum. So let's do this. Yeah. And then let's keep the trumpets as we had them originally in just the octaves. That sounds pretty good to me. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to actually now finally talk about putting them all together. So you'll see here we have very full voicings in the brass. So that enables us to do very high, very low register stuff with the strings, because you just don't need to layer with strings in the middle. So if I did, you'd hear this. You barely hear it. It's not contributing anything meaningful, right? So instead, I would have strings somewhere up here. Maybe even winds as well. Okay, and then lastly, we would have just accentuating the bass. That would then free up our trumpet to not be so dominant on the melody if we didn't want it to be. So if we wanted, we could do more triadic stuff like... So you see voicings for strings and winds become a little easier if the brass is carrying, but it does make sense to take the extra time. You see, you'll notice I spent the most time working out the brass voicings. That's because it's really important if you're then going to do full orchestra. It's the thing that's literally the backbone of the harmony. And obviously, this is just the beginning of what we could talk about with orchestral voicings, but this is a general guideline for how you'd actually approach this, is avoiding thirds, making sure you're working with closed versus open voicings and knowing the difference, using good voice leading, making sure that you know the distinction between different sections in winds and brass, and making sure that if you're doing full orchestra that you're pushing that harmony much more towards the brass than the other instruments. If you'd like to see the full uncut live stream, I have that available to my patrons at the $10 level and up, so you can check that out. I've linked that in the description. Thank you all so much for watching. You can leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next video.